It's been damn close to 20 years since the heyday of Machiavellian base building that was headlined by titles like Dungeon Keeper and the original Evil Genius. If we're going by the nostalgia cycle, it's still a little early for the genre to be making a comeback, but in video game years, it's been an eternity and a half, and Evil Genius 2 is a welcome attempt to relive the genre's glory days. And thankfully, the game sticks the landing, providing some pretty satisfying base building that's largely oriented around assembling and maintaining a semi-competent workforce. But while Evil Genius 2 has a pretty solid foundation, you have to spend a lot of time digging to get to it through obtuse, time-consuming, micromanagement-heavy side systems that put a damper on what's otherwise a pretty solid title. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're conniving to take over the world in Evil Genius 2. Evil Genius 2's greatest strength is far and away its presentation. You don't just get to be a Bond movie supervillain, you get to be a Saturday morning cartoon Bond supervillain. And the collision of those two styles is infectious. The visuals are bright and about 2 steps away from an Austin Powers movie, your rivals in the forces of justice bring just the right level of campy charm, and that opening theme. The goofy little cutscenes can feel a little too campy sometimes, but overall, everything Evil Genius 2 does on an aesthetic front is a grand slam. And the game has style and substance. At its core, it's mostly a resource management game, and the main resource you're managing is manpower. There are a million tasks to do around the base. You always want someone manning the cameras, someone's gotta get to crunching the numbers on your old-timey computers to get you intel, and of course, you want your science division working around the clock to tech you up. And Evil Genius 2 gives you remarkably few tools to make sure that all these critical jobs are staffed. There's no way of prioritizing jobs to make sure a particular guard post always has someone working it compared to a less important spot, nor a way to break your workforce down into shifts to ensure that all your workers don't take their lunch break at the same time. All you get is a tiny little AoE around your main character that can ensure a half dozen jobs in one spot get worked, which is great for if you need to clear out a new room in a hurry, but woefully inadequate for managing the entire base. Which means you have to brute force it and make sure that you always have the extra staff to fill all the base's jobs, even if half of them are off sleeping or having a sandwich. The situation gets complicated by the fact that there's a dozen different worker types, most of which require on-the-job training and therefore a bit of pre-planning. Add in a bunch of meters you have to balance to keep your staff happy, and yeah, like 80% of the base building in this game is centered around training and managing an effective workforce. And Evil Genius 2's favorite way to put up some resistance to the player is to put pressure on your minion pipeline. The most obvious way this happens is when the forces of justice come knocking and kill a dozen of your mooks periodically, but it's not the only one. If you want to get money to do anything, you have to go out on the world stage, which requires you to siphon off workers, and you never get those back. So you are always looking for more hired help, and the game only gives you a slow and constant drip of new staff. If that's not enough to keep you fully staffed, you have to go spend hard-earned money to jumpstart your workforce again before you can continue progressing down its main story. And yes, there is a main story of sorts. It's very light and there's not much worth talking about, but it's enough to give you some direction and keep the game moving along. However, Evil Genius 2 is also full of distractions.
I can barely hear myself think. All your incessant babbling, the constant construction.
And the gunshots.
Yes, the gunshots are particularly disruptive.
There are all kinds of different extraneous systems that require constant micromanaging and keep you from enjoying that core loop without actually adding anything of value to it. The worst offender is the world stage itself, which is mostly just a glorified form of passive income with extra steps. While we just got done covering why its existence isn't a total waste since it's constantly draining manpower, the actual process of engaging with it is pretty underwhelming and just a massive time sink. Hit up this screen, tell your mooks to go rob banks in a dozen countries, and oh, don't forget to check back every 5 minutes to check your operation's heat. What's heat, you ask? It's this nifty bar tracking how much attention your minions are getting from the local authorities, and when it fills up, the whole region shuts down for like 5 minutes and becomes useless. Which basically means that any given base can only function half the time, since doing most jobs will come close to filling it, and it takes a half hour to cool the region back down again. And most of the time, this isn't an issue, and you can hum along just fine even if a region or two is under too much heat. But if there's ever a story-based objective in a specific region you need to hit up, sometimes you just end up having to wait a half hour before you actually get to do it. But even that is barely enough to really warrant commentary. This is far from the first game to have a bit of bland busy work. But unfortunately, this game is a triple threat of frustrating design, featuring not just bland gameplay, but heavily micromanaging gameplay that you're forced to constantly interact with every 2 minutes as you have to constantly babysit a dozen ticking timers, along with a relatively unintuitive and fiddly UI featuring icons made for ants, twisting, and poorly defined borders that make it difficult to read what each individual base on the map is doing at a glance, and worst of all, no way to zoom directly to 1 out of the 10 criminal networks that's idle and actually needs attention. It took me the better part of my entire playtime to even notice that there were 2 different cell tower blips to signify when a network was idle or not. Instead, I spent way too much time individually flipping between all of them, squinting to figure out whether they're actually doing something or not, until I found the one needle in the haystack that I actually needed to look at. And if only one of these issues were present, I'd barely even consider it worth commenting on because whatever, don't sweat the small stuff. But when all 3 are compounding each other, you get a mechanic that I actively hate having to engage with. I want this to be a menu I pop open for 10 seconds, hit 2 buttons, then go back to something more interesting. Instead, I spent a good half of my time playing here, fucking around, trying to find the one base that isn't making me money. And the micromanaging nightmare doesn't end there, unfortunately. Whenever hostile investigators start creeping around your base, you have to actually physically spot them and mark them for death. Otherwise, they just waltz right in and out. And I get the idea here. It forces you to pay attention and actually explore the space you built. But when investigators show up literally every 5 minutes, that means I'm spending more time playing Where's Waldo than I am actually playing the game. And then once you drag the saps to prison, they go and break out again 30 seconds later. Hilariously enough, I've run into multiple instances of one squad breaking out of prison at the same time another is walking into the base and teaming up for a massive brawl at my base's front door. And the wildest part of all is that my experience could have been so much worse than this. Evil Genius 2 is a pretty obtuse game in general, and it's one that definitely benefits from having Google up on your second monitor. I would have chucked my monitor across the room if I hadn't noticed that bit about the cell towers, and I'd be groaning even more about investigators breaking out of their prison cells every 10 goddamn seconds if not for the handy tip I found online that I can mix and match rooms and, for example, put a guard post in the middle of my prison room. Or if I hadn't looked up the fact that there's a research tech that lets me designate certain areas of my base as automatic kill zones if an invader gets spotted there. It's a tech I still can't research, even 8 hours in, because the game has hard-locked it behind story progression, which is an infuriating design decision, I want to be entirely clear. But I suppose getting basic quality of life functions 10 hours into a game is better than them not existing at all? I guess? But alright, let's ask the big question. What do you get out of 5 hours with Evil Genius 2? This is definitely a much longer title, so I ended up messing around in it for a few extra hours, clocking in a total of 8. And even with the extra time, I am only just starting to get comfortable with Evil Genius 2 and falling into a good rhythm. That's not a huge surprise for a game in this genre, but I also feel distinctly like it didn't have to be this way. There are so many parts of this game that are unnecessarily obtuse, and so many systems that are just pointless busy work. Combined with the fact that the most important mechanics in this game run on half-hour real-time clocks, Evil Genius's length feels like an artificial choice, rather than a consequence of actually having a long, content-packed game. And because of that, even though I'm only just getting the hang of the game, and I'm only like a quarter of the way in, I'm already checking the clock and warily closing the game earlier than intended to go play something else instead. When I'm playing Evil Genius 2 in the moment, I'm usually having a perfectly decent time. I can see why this game would appeal to someone. But when I sit back and try to talk about it, when I actually think about what I spent my time doing in this game, a vast majority of it is wasting my time messing around with fiddly, obtuse, bland, and time-consuming busy work instead of actually doing any base building or advancing the game's story along. And when that hits me, I ask myself, why am I not playing any of the 24 grand strategy or base building titles I already own? Games where I spend the lion's share of my time actually building something or making interesting decisions. You know, actually playing them instead of doing the video game equivalent of filing my paperwork. Evil Genius 2 is a perfectly fine game, but just pound for pound, minute for minute, there are a lot of other similar-ish titles that are just as entertaining without all the busy work. And if you're like me and only have a little bit of free time, those other options are probably a better way to spend it. Hey, if you enjoyed this review, consider supporting me on Patreon. With your generous support, I can start doing all kinds of cool stuff, like more in-depth video essays and 5-hour streams where I review games like this in real time. So if any of that sounds cool, please consider becoming a patron today. But I hope you enjoyed this first 5 review. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.